All right. Again, thanking God the Father, the Son, and the Spirit for the praise that they are all due, if for no other reason. Let's call 2 Corinthians chapter 7, why? Understanding that we have dealt with that as a topic before when dealing with the question of what are our motivations, or when we're dealing with the issue of how our motivations relate to our purpose. But now, in this letter where Paul is dealing with some unresolved friction with the church at Corinth, why can also help us understand how motives matter in resolving conflict, as well as they seem to be a sub-theme of this chapter that seems to show the Corinthians and Paul growing a little bit closer together over a familiar issue, that being the young man who had his father's wife. He's already talked about that in chapter 2, in addition to his address, or the way he addressed it in 1 Corinthians. But here, I think he's going to give us a nuance that help us understand how motives can help resolve friction. In this chapter, where in verse 1, he is going to pick up the baton from chapter 6 and in some ways from chapter 5 by telling them it is not, once again, just the fact that they have been saved that gives them a reason to just kind of sit back and rest. As he's going to encourage them in verse 1. Since we have these promises, a lot of them, the promises from the last chapter, had to do with the way that God does not simply tolerate his people following behind anyone, especially those who are leading them away from the reconciliation that God is calling them to. Understanding that God will hold us all accountable for the way that we go about following him. He's saying, since we have these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from every defilement of body and spirit, bringing holiness to completion. Once again, seeming to call to mind that distinction between justification and sanctification that we saw back in his letter to the Romans, talking about justification being likened more to the point of salvation, sanctification being the process behind that moment that leads to the ultimate prize, all the things that God has promised. They're both essential. Neither is optional. Understanding that, though, he is going to narrow his focus onto the church at Corinth in verses 2 through 4 by, once again, as he did in the last chapter, making an appeal to them to open their hearts or make room in their hearts for them. Why? Because they've wronged no one, corrupted no one, and taken advantage of no one, he is going to say. And more importantly, as he mentioned in the last chapter, it's simply reciprocal, understanding that even though they have friction, Paul has already opened his heart to them. It's going to matter because he is not going to simply offer the words to say that he's opened his heart to them. He's going to say how they have comforted him even in his affliction in verse 4, going on through 2 verses 5 through 9, where he's going to not simply ask for sympathy when he goes into detail about his sufferings in Macedonia. He is going to talk about the way that word through Titus of what happened in Corinth is going to actually encourage them, because Titus himself was encouraged, quite possibly not knowing what he was going to find in Corinth. Finding the way that they received him, apparently relatively well, is going to encourage Titus. And then he is going to give word back to Paul. And that word about the way Titus was received, and more importantly, the way they received Paul's words, rebuke in a lot of ways, that's all going to be encouraging to Paul, even in spite of the afflictions that they found, as he's going to say, at every turn in Macedonia. So he makes that point in verse 5. But he's going to go on to say that even though his letter, the one that has led to, at this point, his encouragement, even though it grieved the Corinthians, he's going to say he's not sorry, even though he was sorry that it made them upset. But he's going to say it had a larger purpose, because the payout has been that it produced repentance that led to a godly grief, that he is going to go into more detail distinguishing from worldly grief in verses 10 through 12, where he's going to say in verse 10, for godly grief produces repentance that leads to salvation without regret, whereas worldly grief produces death, a point that, God willing, we might not really pick it up here, but we might go back to it. Okay, let me talk about it now. Bottom line is, worldly grief, this may not be what he's literally saying, but it reminded me of that kind of grief that really is more akin to shame. We've heard some people say, people who are sorry they got caught, not sorry that they did something wrong. That's what this sentence or verse reminds me of, when he is distinguishing godly grief that actually provokes or prompts a person to actually make changes, maybe regardless of whether or not they got caught. The fact that they know that they're doing something wrong causes them to make legitimate changes, as opposed to the kind of grief, even if he's not talking about that when he says worldly grief, it reminds me of the kind of grief where as long as the eyes are on people and they are under the shame of a certain thing, then they might make cosmetic changes that don't really last. Thus, he says, at least there is a type of grief that still produces death, quite possibly because as opposed to godly grief that produces repentance, that kind of grief produces none or incomplete or simply temporary change. Going on, though, he is going to say, in addition to the repentance and the value that he found in the godly grief that they have shown, he's probably encouraged even more in spite of the fact that his letter grieved them because it's revealed something else about them, and that is the earnestness in their character. Meaning, just as we talked about the distinction between godly grief and worldly grief, it seems that they were proven to be genuine. And that's one of the things that really caught my attention that I will, God willing, go back to at the end of the summary. Anyway, let's just keep going. Because in verses 13 through 16, he is going to go into more of a discussion about how, in spite of his comfort and the way that Titus brought comfort to them with the good news of how Corinth received the letter, Titus himself was actually made glad because of the way that they received him and hosted him while he was there on pretty much what could potentially have been unpleasant business. But in summary, there are times when knowing that people care has a lot to do with resolving conflict. And there are times when I can be at friction with somebody. I can lose touch with the fact that they still care what I think about them. And so here, when Paul is letting them know in verse 4 that he thinks well of them, and then in verse 13 that he's encouraged by them or literally comforted by them, and then in verse 16 that he is confident in them as he concludes that chapter, it seems that the Corinthians care what Paul thinks about them, even if they might be a little heated with him at the moment. And some of them might not be sure how credible an apostle or a servant of God that he is. And so there are times when in the friction of a disagreement, I can forget that the other people still may care what I think about them. And so in reassuring people that the things that I'm saying don't come from a motivation of resentment or hatred or bitterness, sometimes that alone can help bridge the gap more than hashing it out and coming to a complete agreement can. As a matter of fact, letting people know that I'm not necessarily coming from a place of, even if I'm getting animated, anger, resentment, or hostility can help make the words fall on a more open and willing ear. And then likewise, vice versa. Reminding me of the point I wanted to circle back to, and that is the way that I can sometimes presume too much on or into the motives of others when I see certain character traits, like the ones Paul wrote about in 1 Corinthians, meaning the Corinthians had become overconfident in many things, amongst them their knowledge and their gifts, right? And so there are times when I can see a thing like overconfidence or pride and assume that it goes along with a hard heart. But going through 2 Corinthians this time, chapter 7, it really changed my perspective on the Corinthians as I'm starting to see Paul seem to show signs of being able to move towards reconciliation with them. And so even though they were proud, they did not have a hardened enough heart. Their pride didn't come with a hardened enough heart that they can't actually reconcile with Paul, understanding that they didn't have to listen in the first place. As we mentioned back in chapter 2, when he talks about the way that they actually followed his advice to use church discipline in that circumstance. And now, not only have they created an improvement in the situation with the young man, it seems that their willingness to listen is also improving their relationship with Paul, reminding me of the pride that we actually saw in the disciples, or those who would become the apostles, who over and over again we see arguing about who the best is. But that didn't mean they weren't willing to listen to Jesus. And so when we were talking about this whole question of motives, a lot of times I can fall into a circumstance where my life experience can have me projecting on to others the thing that I have seen, which might be a high correlation between pride and a hardened heart or a rigid perspective. But that can be another mistake that can unnecessarily strain the possibility of reconciliation, because pride doesn't always go along with a hard heart. And so just as Paul has made many mentions throughout 1 Corinthians and maybe more low key here in 2nd, probably more in 1 Corinthians, he talked about their pride a whole lot. But their pride did not prevent them from actually being able to get along, as we are seeing. Titus might have been surprised at how well they received them. or how well they received him, even though he was coming with a harsh word from Paul. And likewise, Paul seems to be at least somewhat surprised, even though they still have what seems to be some friction, at the way that they've received him, even though he had a harsh word for them. And so that helps me to understand that it's so important to ask or pray for God to open our eyes, to help us see the opportunities in situations that might otherwise be lent towards or be bent towards conflict, because there might be hope in situations where we might have grown hopeless in the difficulty, which is why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. God willing, or God, please help us never become so overcome with our differences or our friction, particularly our frictions with other brothers, that we lose sight of the opportunities for peace that you are showing us. As we often say, though, God's best to you as you go forward with him, and as he, God willing, shows us opportunities in places where we might have given up on the possibility of peace.